"My dog sniffed out the truth," said the homeless man in court. Everyone laughed, but the dog proved the impossible. The courtroom at the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse was in absolute silence when Michael Sanders entered, escorted by 2 court officers. His clothes were clean but visibly worn, patched at the elbows and knees. The smell of cheap soap mixed with nervous sweat emanated from his skin as he walked toward the defendant's bench. But he wasn't alone. By his side, held by a worn-out rope that served as a leash, a brindle and white mutt followed his every step with absolute devotion. The dog had floppy ears, a scar on its snout, and those deep brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. His name was Thor, though no one in the room knew that yet. The murmuring started as soon as they entered. Journalists whispered among themselves. Onlookers pointed discreetly. The prosecutor, Ms. Elizabeth Carter, rolled her eyes with visible disdain. Judge Harold Thompson banged his gavel, demanding order. He was a man in his early 60s, hair completely white, face lined by decades of sentencing other people's fates. His reading glasses rested on the tip of his nose as he leafed through the case files with that expression of professional boredom that only years on the criminal bench can sculpt. He announced the case number 0059328-24.2024, the people of the state of New York versus Michael Sanders. The charge was murder in the 2nd degree. The silence that fell over the room was so dense that the sound of Thor's breathing seemed amplified. The dog sat at Michael's feet, but his eyes never stopped moving, analyzing every person present with a disquieting intelligence. The public defender, Miss Amanda Lee, was a woman too young for the burden she carried. She was 29, with deep dark circles from sleepless nights studying impossible cases, and that almost imperceptible tremor in her hands that betrays excessive responsibility and a lack of resources. Judge Thompson ordered them to begin, and Prosecutor Elizabeth Carter stood up with precise theatrical movements. She was a woman in her 40s, black hair tied in an impeccable bun, a suit that screamed power and ambition. There were rumors she planned to run for state assembly, and high-profile cases were her political springboards. She began in a firm, calculated voice. She said they had before them a man accused of murdering Robert Myers, a 52-year-old businessman, heir to the Myers Group, one of the state's most powerful conglomerates. The body had been found 3 months ago in the parking garage of his penthouse on 5th Avenue, with severe blunt force trauma to the head. The prosecutor made a dramatic pause, walking slowly before the jury. Michael Sanders, she continued, was homeless. He lived in the vicinity of the building where the victim resided. Security cameras captured him at the location on the night of the crime. And most importantly, Mr. Sanders had a history of verbal altercations with the victim. She turned to Michael with a smile that pretended to be understanding, but distilled pure condescension. She understood, she said, that life on the streets was hard, that people like Michael faced challenges she couldn't imagine. But murder was murder, regardless of the circumstances. Michael clenched his fists, feeling the familiar anger growing in his chest. Thor perceived the tension and nudged his snout against his leg, a comforting gesture that made all the difference. Judge Thompson leafed through the files with a bored expression. He asked if the defense had anything to declare before they proceeded, without even looking up from the papers. Amanda Lee cleared her throat, her voice coming out shakier than she would have liked. She said her client maintained his innocence, that the evidence presented was circumstantial, that Michael Sanders was prepared to demonstrate that he was not only innocent, but that he knew who had truly committed the crime. The judge finally looked up, his eyebrows arching with mocking interest. Oh yes? And how exactly did he plan to demonstrate that? It was then that Michael stood up, ignoring Amanda's warning touch on his arm. His voice came out hoarse, unused to speaking in formal settings. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, "my dog discovered the truth." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then, as if someone had opened the floodgates of a dam, the room exploded in laughter. Judge Thompson threw his head back and let out a booming laugh that made his large frame vibrate. Prosecutor Elizabeth covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with laughter. Journalists exchanged incredulous looks. Jury members smiled openly. Amid the laughter, the judge managed to say that this was new. In 35 years on the bench, he had never heard someone blame a dog for criminal investigation. What was next? Canine witnesses? More laughter erupted. Thor began to growl softly, a sound only Michael and Amanda could hear. The dog didn't like that laughter. He didn't like seeing Michael being humiliated. Prosecutor Carter regained her composure enough to declare that this demonstrated exactly what she had been arguing. The defendant was clearly disconnected from reality. She would suggest a psychiatric evaluation before they proceeded. Michael's voice cut through the air, stronger this time. "You can laugh," he said. "You can mock. But Thor found evidence that you didn't even bother to look for, because you decided I was guilty the moment you saw my torn clothes and my lack of a fixed address." The judge's laughter froze. There was something in the way this man looked at them that was disconcerting. It wasn't the empty, resigned expression he expected from homeless people accused of crimes. It was pure determination, mixed with an intelligence that circumstances had failed to erase. Amanda seized the moment. She formally requested that her client be allowed to explain his version of the facts. She argued that if he could present evidence the police had neglected, that was relevant to his defense. The judge looked at the prosecutor, who rolled her eyes but gestured with her hand as if to say, "Let him make a fool of himself." Thompson leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. He said he would allow Mr. Sanders to explain his theory, but when he was finished making a spectacle of himself, he expected him to accept a plea deal and save everyone's time. Michael took a deep breath. It was his only chance. He started by saying that Thor was not an ordinary dog. He was a trained search and rescue dog. The prosecutor interrupted immediately, asking, "Trained by whom?" Michael was homeless. How would he have access to professional canine training? Michael looked her directly in the eyes. "Because I wasn't always homeless," he answered. "And Thor wasn't always just my companion." The murmuring returned to the room. The judge banged his gavel, calling for silence, and ordered Michael to explain. And then Michael began to tell a story that would change everything. 5 years ago, he said. His name wasn't Michael Sanders. It was Captain Michael Sanders of the New York Police Department. He served in the K-9 unit, specializing in search and rescue dogs. Thor wasn't just any mutt. He was a trained NYPD K-9, specialized in locating missing persons and detecting evidence. One of the best in the unit. The room fell into absolute silence. Even the prosecutor stopped smiling. Michael continued, his voice gaining strength as the memories returned. 4.5 years ago, he and Thor were called to a search operation. An 8-year-old girl had gone missing in the Bronx. They followed the trail for 2 days. Thor found the girl trapped in an abandoned drainage pipe, still alive. But when they returned to the surface, they discovered the operation had been used as a distraction. While they were looking for the girl, who had been placed there on purpose, a criminal group executed a bank heist on the other side of the city, and corrupt police officers had facilitated it all. Michael's voice began to tremble. He tried to report what he had discovered. He tried to do the right thing. But the people involved had power, had connections. Instead of the case being investigated, he was accused of insubordination, fabricating evidence, contempt for superiors. He was dishonorably discharged from the NYPD. He lost his pension, his rights, his reputation. Within months, he lost his apartment, then his car, then everything. Amanda listened with tears in her eyes. She hadn't known about that. Michael had never told her. "The only thing I didn't lose," Michael said, looking at Thor, "was him. Because when they kicked me out of the force, they decided Thor was too old to continue in service. They were going to put him down. But I saved him. Or perhaps he saved me." Thor looked at Michael and tilted his head as if he understood every word. There was a connection between that man and that animal that transcended what anyone in that room could comprehend. Judge Thompson was no longer laughing. He asked if Michael could prove that story. Michael replied that he had his service records, which could be requested. He had scars from a botched operation. And he had Thor, whose microchip would still identify him as property of the New York Police Department. Prosecutor Carter was visibly uncomfortable. This wasn't what she had expected. She requested a recess to verify the information presented. The judge agreed, banging his gavel. 15-minute recess. As the room partially emptied, Amanda approached Michael. Why had he never told her that? Why had he let her defend him without knowing his full story? Michael replied wearily that he had tried to tell his story before. No one believed him. A homeless man claiming to have been a cop? It was easier to believe he was crazy, so he stopped trying. But now it was different, she insisted. If he could prove he had training in criminal investigation, that Thor was a professional dog, that changed everything. Michael shook his head. What changed everything, he said, was what Thor found 3 nights before Robert Meyer's murder. Amanda sat down, finally understanding. What did Thor find? Michael looked around to make sure no one was listening. He told her that he and Thor slept in an alley 2 blocks from Meyer's building. On the night in question, Thor woke up agitated. It wasn't normal. It was that kind of agitation he had when he detected something during operations. Michael followed him. Thor led him to the building's parking garage where he sniffed something near a car. When Michael approached to look, he found a cell phone hidden behind a tire. The phone's battery was almost dead, but it still worked. And when Michael opened it, he found messages. Messages between Robert Myers and people discussing what seemed to be drug trafficking and money laundering. But it wasn't just any small scheme. It involved sums in the millions. And the names in the messages included powerful people, police officials, judges, businessmen. Michael photographed everything he could with an old phone he possessed. Then he returned the cell phone to its place, fearing that if someone saw him with it, they would assume he had stolen it. 3 days later, Robert Myers was dead. And Michael, who had been seen near the building, was immediately named a suspect. Amanda processed the information frantically. Where were those photos now? Michael said they were on his phone, which the police had confiscated as evidence when they arrested him. The defender was already dialing numbers, talking to assistants, urgently requesting access to her client's belongings. When the recess ended, the atmosphere in the room was completely different. Judge Thompson no longer had that mocking expression. Prosecutor Carter was visibly nervous, speaking in a low voice with her assistants. Thompson announced that they had verified Michael's story. He had indeed served in the NYPD, and Thor's microchip confirmed he was property of the department, officially retired from service 4 years ago. That didn't prove innocence, the prosecutor hurried to say. It only confirmed part of his past. The evidence for the murder remained. But then Amanda stood up with documents in her hand. She had requested access to Michael's cell phone, property that had been confiscated, and the forensic analysis had revealed something extraordinary. The phone contained photographs dated 3 days before the murder. Photographs of messages that seemed to implicate Robert Myers himself in criminal activities. The room exploded in murmurs. The prosecutor demanded to see the images immediately. Amanda projected them onto the large screen. There, for all to see, were the messages. Discussions about deliveries, transfers, problems with suppliers, coded language but unmistakable to anyone familiar with criminal investigations. And then a specific message appeared that made everyone's blood run cold. Robert Myers had written, "The judge is demanding his cut. If we don't pay, he'll expose everything." The news camera zoomed in on the word judge. Journalists began typing frantically. Prosecutor Carter was pale. She asked how they could be sure those photos were authentic, that they hadn't been manipulated. Amanda replied that the forensic analysis of the phone confirmed the photos were original, with intact metadata showing the date, time, and location. And that location corresponded exactly to the parking garage where Robert Myers' body would be found days later. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his expression now completely serious. He ordered the complete forensic report to be brought to him immediately. Michael remained seated, Thor at his feet. The dog had that calm expression of someone who knew the truth would come out from the beginning. But then something happened that no one expected. A man at the back of the room stood up abruptly and ran towards the exit. He was one of the prosecutor's assistants, a young lawyer in an expensive suit whom no one had paid much attention to until that moment. Court officers tried to stop him, but he was fast. He almost reached the door when Thor, in a move that surprised everyone, slipped out of the rope leash and ran after him. The dog intercepted the man with military precision, not biting, but blocking his path and growling so intimidatingly that the lawyer froze. Security guards reached the man and detained him while Thor calmly returned to Michael. As if nothing had happened, Judge Thompson banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. What was happening? The detained man yelled that he knew nothing, that he was just leaving to get documents. But his panic said otherwise. Amanda asked them to check his identification. When the officers did, they discovered something interesting. His name was Leonard Myers, nephew of Robert Myers. Leonard Myers was escorted back into the room under the custody of the court officers. His Armani suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked, and drops of sweat streamed down his forehead despite the powerful air conditioning. His hands trembled visibly as the officers sat him in a chair next to the prosecutor's table. Prosecutor Elizabeth Carter was visibly shocked. She looked at her assistant as if seeing him for the first time. Leonard had worked in her office for 6 months, always efficient, always discreet, but he had never mentioned being related to the victim. Judge Thompson ordered him to explain immediately why a relative of the victim was working in the prosecutor's office investigating the case. Leonard tried to regain his composure, wiping sweat with a handkerchief. He said there was no conflict of interest. He was just an administrative assistant. He didn't have access to case strategies. And technically, he used his mother's maiden name on work documents, Leonard Allen. But the prosecutor was already frantically reviewing the files. Why had he hidden that information? Leonard lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. He murmured that he thought he would be removed from the case if he revealed it, and he needed to be close to the investigation. Why? the judge pressed. Why did he need to be close? The silence that followed was deafening. Leonard opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water. It was then that Thor started barking. It wasn't an aggressive bark, but an insistent one, directed specifically at Leonard. The dog pulled on the improvised leash, trying to get closer to the young lawyer. Michael held Thor firmly, but watched attentively. He knew every one of Thor's behaviors, and that specific bark meant something. It was the same bark he used when he detected something hidden during search operations. Michael asked the judge for permission to check something. Thompson, still processing the chaos the hearing had become, vaguely waved his hand. Michael approached Leonard with Thor. The dog sniffed intensely at the leather briefcase the young lawyer held against his chest as if it were a shield. Thor sat and barked once, a clear, definitive bark. It was the alert signal he was trained to give when he found something. Michael held out his hand, asking for the briefcase. Leonard clutched it tighter, saying it was private property. Judge Thompson intervened, ordering Leonard to hand over the briefcase immediately. If he had nothing to hide, there was no reason to refuse. With hands shaking violently, Leonard handed over the leather briefcase. Michael opened it and began reviewing the documents inside. There were contracts, legal notes, nothing extraordinary at first glance. But Thor kept sniffing insistently. Michael knew that behavior. There was something more. He examined the briefcase more carefully, running his fingers over the inner lining. And then he felt something, a slight irregularity in the leather. He pressed it and a secret compartment opened. Inside was a flash drive. The entire room held its breath. Amanda took the flash drive with a tissue to preserve possible fingerprints and handed it to the court technician. Minutes later, the content was being projected onto the large screen. What appeared made several people in the room gasp audibly. They were audio files, recordings of conversations, and the first one they played was between Robert Myers and Leonard, dated 1 month before the murder. Robert's voice sounded tense in the recording. "Leonard, you need to understand the gravity of what you're asking me. I can't just transfer half of the family inheritance to you before my death. That would raise suspicions." Leonard's voice responded, laden with resentment. "Suspicions? Uncle, you embezzled millions from the company, laundered money for years, and I know all about it. I have proof, so either you give me what is rightfully mine, or I expose everything." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the ventilation system seemed to have stopped making noise. The recording continued. Robert said, "Are you threatening me? Your own uncle?" "It's not a threat," Leonard replied coldly. "It's business. You taught me that business is business. Feelings don't enter the equation." The recording ended with Robert saying he needed time to think. The technician loaded the next file. It was from 2 weeks later. This time, Robert sounded defeated. "All right, I'll do what you want. But after this, I don't want to see your face again. You've ceased to be family to me." "Perfect," Leonard responded. "I'll prepare the documents." But there was more. The last recording was from 3 days before the murder, and this time it wasn't a conversation, but a monologue. Leonard talking to himself, apparently recording his own thoughts. He changed his mind. The old idiot grew a conscience at the last minute. Said he's going to the police, that he's going to confess everything, that he prefers prison to being blackmailed by his own nephew. Well, if he wants to go to the police, he'll have to do it from the great beyond. Leonard's voice in the recording paused before continuing. "I already have it all planned out. The homeless guy who stays near the building is perfect. Everyone's seen him argue with my uncle. He has a history of mental issues according to his NYPD records. It will be easy to pin the blame on him. No one believes a homeless person anyway." The room exploded in scandalized murmurs. Leonard was white as a sheet, sweat pouring off him now. The recording continued, and what came next was even more shocking. "The best part is that I can do this from the prosecutor's office. I have access to all the case files. I can make sure any evidence that might incriminate me disappears. That the investigators only follow the leads I want them to follow." Amanda was on her feet, speaking rapidly. This wasn't just a confession to murder. It was evidence of obstruction of justice, manipulation of a criminal investigation, abuse of a position of trust. Prosecutor Carter had tears of anger in her eyes. She ordered Leonard's immediate arrest. But Judge Thompson raised his hand, calling for silence. There were still questions that needed to be answered. He turned to Michael with an expression that mixed respect and curiosity. How did Thor know Leonard had that flash drive? Michael explained that Thor didn't know specifically about the flash drive, but he was trained to detect suspicious behaviors in humans. Extreme anxiety, nervous sweat, accelerated heart rate. These are chemical changes that trained dogs can detect. When Leonard tried to flee, His panic reached levels that Thor recognized as an alert. The judge processed the information. Then he asked something everyone was thinking. Why had Leonard kept those recordings? It was basically evidence against himself. It was Amanda who answered, her voice laden with disgust. Insurance. He recorded everything as insurance in case someone tried to blame him. He planned to use it as leverage. It's the thinking of a psychopath who always needs to have control. Leonard finally spoke, his voice coming out strangled. You don't understand. My uncle was a criminal. He stole from the family for years. I was just taking what was rightfully mine. Michael stood up, his voice thundering through the room. And me? I was just a convenient pawn? You were going to let me rot in prison for a crime I didn't commit because I was invisible enough not to matter? Leonard looked at him with a disdain he could no longer disguise. You're a bum. A dishonorably discharged ex-cop. Who was going to believe you? The silence that followed was charged with a collective anger. Everyone in the room understood in that moment how the system failed the most vulnerable. But Judge Thompson had one more question. How had Leonard carried out the murder if the security cameras didn't show him at the location? Leonard smiled bitterly. He had access to the security system. He simply deleted the relevant files. And as for the act itself, it was simple. Waited for his uncle in the parking garage late at night. A tire iron. 2 blows. Done. The coldness in his voice as he described the murder made several people present shudder. Prosecutor Carter ordered officers to take him into custody immediately. Leonard was escorted out, his screams about having rights echoing down the corridors. When the chaos finally subsided, Judge Thompson turned to Michael. Mr. Sanders, he said, his voice laden with unusual emotion, this court owes you a profound apology. You were humiliated, ridiculed, and nearly convicted of a crime you did not commit, and all because we allowed prejudices to cloud our judgment. Michael remained standing, Thor by his side. He didn't respond immediately, processing decades of injustices that were finally being acknowledged. The judge continued, I declare you innocent of all charges. Furthermore, I order a full investigation into how the system failed so spectacularly in this case, and I request that the NYPD review your discharge in light of the new information about systemic corruption. Amanda hugged Michael, both crying. Thor barked happily, his tail wagging forcefully. But then, something extraordinary happened. Colonel James Miller, commander of the NYPD K-9 unit, who had been sitting discreetly in the back of the room observing everything, stood up and walked to the front. He asked for permission to speak, and the judge agreed. Miller was about 50, with an impeccable military posture, medals on his chest that told a story of decades of service. He looked at Michael with a grave expression. Captain Sanders, he began, using the rank Michael had lost. I commanded another division when you were discharged, but I always thought there was something wrong with that story. One of the best officers in the unit, with an impeccable record, suddenly accused of insubordination and fabricating evidence. It never made sense. Michael stared at him, speechless. Miller continued, in recent years, 3 of the senior officers who testified against you have been arrested for corruption. The pieces were falling into place. And now, seeing you here, seeing what Thor did, I am certain you were discharged because you discovered too much, because you were too honest to be bought. The colonel's voice filled with emotion. On behalf of the New York Police Department, I apologize, and if you'll allow me, I would like to offer you reinstatement, with honors, with back pay, and with Thor officially retired with a full pension, as every service dog deserves. The room exploded in applause, but Michael remained motionless, processing words he never thought he would hear. He asked with a choked voice if Miller was serious. The colonel nodded, completely serious. More than that, I want you and Thor to help train the next generation of K-9 teams. Teach them not just technique, but integrity. God knows we need that. Michael looked at Thor. The dog looked back at him with those deep eyes that always seemed to understand everything. And in that gaze, Michael saw 5 years of suffering, but also 5 years of unbreakable loyalty. He replied to the colonel that he accepted, but on one condition. Miller arched an eyebrow. What is it? Michael said he wanted to work on cases involving vulnerable people. The homeless, the displaced, those the system ignores. Thor and he had lived that reality. They knew that world, and they could make a difference. The colonel extended his hand. Deal. When the hearing finally ended and Michael left the courthouse, a crowd was waiting for him. Journalists, cameras, onlookers. But there was also another group. Homeless people who lived in the area. People who knew him, who had shared food with him during the difficult years. An elderly woman approached. Mrs. Gable, who slept near Bryant Park. She hugged Michael, crying, saying she always knew he was innocent. that she always knew he was special. Michael hugged her back and then turned to everyone present. He said that victory wasn't his alone. It belonged to all of them, to every invisible person the system ignores, to every homeless person who is judged before having a chance to speak, to every abandoned animal that still has so much love to give. Thor barked as if in agreement, and the crowd applauded. But as the cameras filmed and journalists asked questions, Michael noticed something. A man watching from afar. Expensive suit, serious expression, talking on the phone while not taking his eyes off Michael. Thor noticed him too, his ears perking up in alert. That night, Michael and Thor were taken to a modest hotel, courtesy of Colonel Miller, while they organized his reinstatement. It was the first time in years Michael had slept in a real bed, but he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the man who had been watching them, about Leonard mentioning powerful people involved in Robert Meyer's scheme, people whose names hadn't yet been revealed. Thor slept at the foot of the bed, but his ears moved occasionally, always on alert even in his sleep. At 3 a.m, the hotel phone rang. Michael answered with his heart racing. The voice on the other end was distorted, clearly using some kind of modulator. The message was brief and terrifying. You saw things you shouldn't have. Your dog found things that should have remained hidden. Stop here, or the next case will be your funeral. The call was cut off. Michael sat up in bed, cold sweat running down his back. Thor woke up immediately, perceiving his companion's anguish. He knew it wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next day, Michael received an unexpected visitor at the hotel. It was Isabella Myers, Robert's widow. She was in her mid-40s, elegant even in mourning, eyes red from crying but with a dignified posture. She asked to speak with him in private. Michael, cautious, agreed, but kept Thor by his side. Isabella began by saying she needed to thank him for finding the truth about who killed her husband, for not letting his psychopathic nephew escape justice. Michael accepted the thanks with a nod, but waited. There was something more. He could see it in her eyes. Isabella confirmed his suspicion. There was something Michael needed to know. Something about Robert that would change everything he thought he understood about the case. She took an envelope from her purse. Inside were letters. Letters Robert had written to her in the weeks before he died. Michael read the first letter, and his blood ran cold. My dearest Isabella, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to do what was right while I was alive. I am involved in something terrible. Trafficking, money laundering, corruption. But the worst is that I know who really runs everything, and that person is untouchable. The letter continued, revealing that Robert had been forced to participate in the scheme. They had threatened his family, but he had decided he could no longer live with the guilt. The last letter, dated the day before his death, was even more revealing. I'm going to the police tomorrow. I'm going to confess everything. I know this means prison, the destruction of our family's reputation, but I prefer that to continuing to be a tool for a monster. Just know that I always loved you and our children, and that I'm trying to do the right thing, even if it's too late. Michael looked at Isabella. So Robert was trying to get out. He was trying to do the right thing. Isabella nodded, tears streaming. He wasn't perfect. He committed terrible crimes. But in the end, he tried to redeem himself, and he was killed for it. She then revealed something else. In the last weeks of his life, Robert had been compiling evidence. Names, transactions, recordings, all stored in a safe place. Michael asked where, and Isabella replied that Robert hadn't said exactly, but had left a clue in the last letter. The dog always knows where the bones are buried. Michael felt a chill. He looked at Thor, who tilted his head as if also processing the information. Isabella continued. She had always thought it was a metaphor, but after seeing Thor in action in the courtroom, after seeing how he found evidence humans didn't, she wondered if it was literal. Michael finished. If Robert had literally buried evidence somewhere a dog could find it. Exactly, Isabella whispered. Michael asked if she had any idea where, and Isabella revealed that Robert had a property in the Hamptons, a place they used to go on weekends. He spent hours in the garden in recent months. She thought it was just a new therapy for stress. But now she wondered if he was hiding something there. Michael said they needed to go check, but Isabella was afraid. The people who threatened Robert, the people who probably ordered his death, wouldn't like them starting to look. It was then that Amanda arrived, breathless. She had run to the hotel after receiving an urgent call. Leonard's flash drive was being analyzed more deeply, and they had found something else in the files. A list of names. People involved in the scheme Robert ran, and one of the names on that list made everyone's heart stop. It was Senior Judge Carl Morrison, one of the most powerful judges in the New York State Court of Appeals. a man with political connections reaching all the way to Washington, D.C. Amanda said they needed to be very careful. If Morrison was involved, he had the resources to make any evidence disappear, to make anyone who threatened him disappear. Michael told her about the threatening call he'd received, about Robert's letters, about the possible evidence buried at the property in the Hamptons. Amanda processed everything frantically. They needed protection. They needed people they could absolutely trust. It was then that Colonel Miller reappeared, this time with 3 other officers from the K-9 unit. He had heard rumors that Michael was in danger, and no member of his unit, current or past, went unprotected. Miller organized everything. They would go to the property in the Hamptons with full police protection. If there was evidence buried there, Thor would find it, and this time, they would ensure it reached the right hands. But just as they were about to leave, Michael received another message. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was an address in downtown Manhattan, and the words, "Come alone if you want to know the whole truth about what happened to you 5 years ago. You were just the first." Michael looked at the address in the message, and then at the group that had formed around him. Miller, Amanda, Isabella, the other K-9 officers, all prepared to go to the Hamptons, all ready to protect him. But that message, "You were just the first." What did that mean? He showed the message to Miller, who frowned with concern. It was obviously a trap. No one in their right mind would go alone to a meeting set by an anonymous message. But Michael felt he had to go. There was something in that message that resonated with an old pain, a wound that had never completely healed. Amanda was categorical. Absolutely not. He wasn't going anywhere alone. If he wanted to go, he would take protection. Michael agreed, but on one condition. Thor would go with him. It had always been Thor and him. It always would be. Miller organized a discreet operation. Michael and Thor would go to the address, but a tactical team would follow at a distance. If anything went wrong, they would be there in seconds. The address led to an abandoned building in the Lower East Side. It had once been a textile factory, now just another concrete skeleton in the heart of Manhattan, covered in graffiti and broken windows. Michael entered with Thor at his side, every sense on high alert. The interior smelled of mold and urine. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating ghostly patterns on the debris-covered floor. A voice echoed from the shadows. "Captain Sanders, or should I say, Michael Sanders? Since the NYPD stripped you of your rank." A man emerged from the darkness. He was about 40, with a scar across his face, an expression of someone who had seen too much. He wore worn jeans and a leather jacket, but there was something in his posture that screamed military training. Michael asked who he was, and the man smiled bitterly. "Lieutenant Marcus Olson, or rather, ex-lieutenant. Like you, I was discharged from the NYPD 6 years ago." Michael's heart raced. 6 years. 1 year before him. Marcus continued, his voice laden with resentment. "I also discovered things I shouldn't have. I also tried to do the right thing, and I was also destroyed for it." Michael took a step forward. "What did you discover?" Marcus looked around as if checking if they were really alone. "I discovered there was a corruption network within the NYPD that went far beyond what anyone imagined. Cops facilitating drug trafficking routes. Senior officers taking bribes to ignore specific crimes. And at the top of it all, protecting everyone, was Senior Judge Morrison, the name that was on Leonard's flash drive, the name everyone was afraid to utter." Marcus told his story. He had served in the narcotics unit. During a routine operation, he found documents linking drug shipments directly to addresses protected by the police. When he tried to report it, he was accused of stealing confiscated drugs. Dishonorably discharged. Life destroyed, just like Michael. "And it wasn't just us," Marcus revealed. "In the last 10 years, at least 15 cops have been discharged on false charges. All because they discovered something. All because they couldn't be bought." Michael felt anger growing. 15 lives destroyed. 15 families ruined. All to protect a corruption network. He asked why Marcus was telling him this now, and the ex-lieutenant took a thick envelope from inside his jacket. "Because I've been compiling evidence for 6 years. Names, dates, transactions. Every cop who was unfairly discharged. Every operation that was sabotaged. Every senior officer who was being paid to look the other way." He handed the envelope to Michael. "But I'm just a discredited ex-cop. No one will listen to me. But you were just acquitted in a high-profile case. You have media attention. You have credibility. You can do what I never could. Expose everything." Michael opened the envelope. It was full of documents, photos, bank records, years of meticulous investigation. Thor began to growl softly. His ears perked up. focused on something neither Michael nor Marcus could hear yet. Marcus noticed. The dog detected something? Michael knew that growl. It meant danger was approaching. He said they needed to leave, but Marcus shook his head. There was something else Michael needed to know. Your discharge, Marcus said urgently, wasn't random. They chose you specifically. Because you were the best. Because you had unquestionable integrity. Because if they could destroy you, they would send a message to everyone else. No one is safe. The words hit Michael like physical blows. It hadn't just been bad luck or being in the wrong place. It had been deliberate. It had been personal. Thor's growl intensified. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Several. Approaching fast. Marcus cursed. They followed me. I was hoping they hadn't, but men dressed in black entered the building from all directions. They weren't police officers. They were private security, the kind powerful people hire when they want something handled discreetly. The group's leader pointed a gun at Michael. Hand over the envelope, and maybe we let you live. Michael calculated his options. They were surrounded. Miller's team was outside, but it would take time for them to get in. It was then that Thor acted. The dog didn't attack the armed men. Instead, he barked 3 quick times, the maximum alert signal, and ran towards a side exit Michael hadn't noticed. It was the training. Thor was indicating an escape route. Michael and Marcus ran after the dog while the security guards opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete, sending fragments flying. Thor guided them through dark corridors, broken stairs, abandoned rooms. The dog knew the way as if he had mentally mapped the entire building. They exited through a back window, falling into a narrow alley. Miller and his team were already there, alerted by the emergency signal Michael had discreetly activated before entering. Shots were exchanged. The private security guards, realizing they were outnumbered by trained police officers, retreated. When the dust settled, 3 security guards were detained. The rest had fled. Miller checked Michael for injuries, but he was unharmed. Thor received enthusiastic pats from all the officers present. He had saved 2 lives that day. Back in safety, Michael introduced Marcus to everyone. He showed them the envelope full of evidence. Amanda examined everything with wide eyes. This was explosive. If true, it would destroy careers, send dozens of people to prison, expose systemic corruption at levels never seen before. But they needed more. They needed the evidence Robert had supposedly buried. They needed a case so solid that not even Senior Judge Morrison could make it disappear. Isabella was still waiting, pale but determined. It was time to go to the Hamptons. The drive took 2 hours. Robert's property was in an isolated area, surrounded by oak and pine trees. The main house was modest but well kept, with an extensive garden that stretched for almost an acre. Isabella guided them to the back of the property, where Robert had spent so much time in recent months. There was an ornamental garden with roses, hydrangeas, and jasmine, and in the center, a small stone fountain that no longer worked. Michael released Thor, giving the search command. The dog began sniffing methodically, covering every inch of the garden. It took 20 minutes. Then Thor started digging furiously near the stone fountain, his barks becoming increasingly insistent. Michael and the other officers joined him, digging with their hands and improvised shovels. Half a meter down, they found a sealed metal box. Isabella opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 3 flash drives, laminated documents, and a thick notebook in Robert's handwriting. Amanda began reading the notebook aloud. It was a detailed diary of 5 years of criminal operations. Every transaction documented, every payment recorded, every person involved named, and there was something more: recordings. Robert had used a hidden recorder in his last months of life. Conversations with Senior Judge Morrison discussing bribes, operations, how to eliminate threats. In one particularly damning recording, Morrison said, "That cop Sanders is getting too curious. I've already activated my contacts in internal affairs. He'll be discharged by the end of the month. No one will believe him after that." Michael heard his own condemnation being planned. He heard his life being destroyed, with the casualness of someone discussing the weather. Tears of anger streamed down his face. Thor nudged his snout against his hand, a comforting gesture he had made thousands of times during 5 years on the streets. Miller placed a heavy hand on Michael's shoulder. They were going to pay, all of them. But before they could leave the property, cars blocked the entrance. They weren't private security this time. They were official police cars, many of them, and leading them was Senior Judge Carl Morrison himself. He was a man in his 60s, perfectly combed gray hair, a suit that cost more than a cheap car. He had that arrogance that only decades of untouchable power can create. Morrison announced that they were all under arrest. Trespassing, theft of evidence, obstruction of justice. He had warrants signed by himself. Miller stepped forward, saying this was unconstitutional, that Morrison was clearly trying to destroy evidence against himself. The senior judge smiled coldly. Prove it. My word against a group of cops with questionable records? Good luck. It was then that Michael realized something. During the entire conversation, one of the flash drives Isabella had taken from the box was in his pocket. And his phone, though old, had recording capability. He discreetly activated the recorder and left the phone in his pocket, microphone exposed. Then he did something risky. He provoked Morrison, asking if he wasn't tired of living in fear. Fear that one day the truth would come out. Morrison laughed, that arrogant laugh of someone who has never lost. Fear. Of you. Of miserable people no one will believe. Michael continued, just like no one believed when you destroyed 15 careers. When you ordered Robert Meyer's death. When you turned the NYPD into an arm of organized crime. Morrison's expression changed. It became dangerous. You have no idea the power you're facing. I've destroyed better men than you with a phone call. Exactly like you destroyed Captain Marcus Olson, Michael pressed. Like you destroyed Lieutenant Carver. Like you destroyed me. Morrison took a threatening step. Yes, I destroyed you. Because you were inconvenient. Because you didn't understand that the system needs flexibility. That pure justice is impossible. That everyone makes compromises. But you, he spat the words, you and your annoying morality, your stupid integrity. You were threats to the balance. So yes, I orchestrated your discharges. I made sure no one would believe you, and I would do it again without hesitation. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the police officers who had come with Morrison seemed shocked by the casual confession. Michael took the phone from his pocket, all recorded, every word. The color drained from Morrison's face. He ordered the police officers to confisc the phone immediately, but none of them moved. They had just heard a senior judge confess to years of corruption, confess to destroying colleagues' careers, confess to being an accomplice to murder. One of the officers, a senior sergeant with 30 years of service, stepped forward. Senior Judge Morrison, he said formally. You are under arrest. Morrison laughed hysterically. You can't arrest me. I'm untouchable. I have connections in D.C. The sergeant just shook his head sadly. Not anymore, sir. Not anymore. 3 months later, the New York State Court of Appeals was packed again. But this time, the one in the defendant's dock was Senior Judge Morrison himself, along with 17 corrupt NYPD officers, 5 businessmen who facilitated money laundering, and Leonard Myers. The trial lasted weeks. Every piece of evidence was presented. Robert's recordings, the detailed diary, the documents compiled by Marcus over 6 years, Morrison's recorded confession. The conviction was unanimous. Morrison received 48 years in prison. Leonard, 25. The others, varying but substantial sentences. But the impact went beyond individual convictions. The case exposed systemic corruption that forced complete reforms within the NYPD. Internal affairs was restructured. New protocols were implemented to protect officers who reported irregularities. And the 15 unfairly discharged officers, including Michael and Marcus, were officially exonerated, their pensions restored, their honors returned. Michael was present when the sentence was read. Thor sitting at his feet, now officially retired with a full pension and a Medal of Honor for exceptional service. After the trial, Michael was surrounded by journalists. They all wanted to know what was next. He smiled, running his hand over Thor's head. He said he and Thor were going to do exactly what Colonel Miller had asked, train the next generation of K-9 teams, but with a special focus on cases involving vulnerable people. A journalist asked if he held any resentment after all he had suffered. Michael thought carefully before answering. Not resentment, but determination. Yes, determination to ensure no other honest cop is destroyed for doing the right thing. Determination that people like me, who end up on the streets, are not invisible. He looked directly at the camera. The system judged me by my torn clothes and lack of address. But Thor judged me by my heart. And in the end, it was his judgment that mattered. The following weeks brought rapid changes. Michael moved to a modest but comfortable apartment, reactivated his pension, began the process of reconnecting with family he had lost contact with during his years on the streets. But the most significant change was the creation of the Thor Project, an initiative he developed with Amanda and Isabella. The project had 2 objectives. First, to train dogs rescued from shelters for search and rescue work, giving abandoned animals a second chance, just as Thor had. Second, to recruit and train homeless and vulnerable people, many with valuable skills society ignored. Michael believed that both dogs and humans discarded by the system had immense value. They just needed an opportunity to prove it. The program's first graduate was a young man named Robert, 23 years old. He had lived on the streets since he was 15, but he had a natural ability with animals. After 6 months of training, he and a rescued Labrador named Max formed an exceptional team. At an emotional ceremony, Michael personally presented Robert with his certificate. He saw in his eyes the same fire he had felt, determination to prove to the world that they mattered. Marcus also found a new purpose. He became a civil rights attorney, specializing in cases of police misconduct. His first client was a mother whose son had been wrongly imprisoned. With the evidence he had compiled over the years, he not only freed the young man but exposed another cell of corruption. Isabella used the fortune inherited from Robert to establish a foundation in his name, not to clean his reputation. He didn't deserve that, but to help families affected by the crimes he facilitated. It was her way of turning guilt into redemption. 1 year after the trial, Michael received an unexpected call. It was from a woman named Clara, who worked for an animal rights NGO. She said they had found a situation in Queens, a clandestine factory using dogs for illegal testing. They needed someone with canine experience to assess the animal's condition and testify about the trauma they had suffered. Michael and Thor went immediately. What they found devastated them. 17 dogs in horrible conditions, traumatized, many injured. But Thor did something extraordinary. He approached each dog gently, without forcing contact, and one by one, using that intelligence and empathy he always possessed, he helped the other dogs calm down. It was as if he understood their trauma, as if he were saying, "I was discarded too. I suffered too. But look at me now." All 17 dogs were rescued. The factory owners were arrested, and Michael personally adopted 3 of the most traumatized dogs, helping them recover. 2 years after his acquittal, Michael was standing in the cemetery where homeless people without family were buried. There was a new memorial there, paid for by Isabella's foundation. It listed the names of homeless people who died alone, forgotten, and at the top of the memorial was a plaque. "You were not invisible. You mattered." Michael placed flowers on the memorial. He thought of everyone he had known on the streets. Mrs. Gable, who had died of pneumonia 6 months ago. John, who had been hit by a car and the driver fled. Maria, who had succumbed to alcohol and despair. Thor sat beside Michael, leaning his weight against his leg, a gesture he had made thousands of times. A silent reminder, you are not alone. Michael knelt, hugging the dog who had saved his life in so many ways. Physically, by finding evidence. Emotionally, by giving him a reason to continue. Spiritually, by reminding him that loyalty and love existed even in a world that seemed to have forgotten both. He whispered in Thor's ear, "You knew from the beginning, didn't you? You knew we would find the truth. You knew justice would come." Thor licked his face, and Michael smiled through his tears. That night, there was a ceremony at the police academy. Michael had been invited as a speaker for the graduation of new officers. He stepped up to the podium with Thor by his side. He looked at those young faces, full of idealism and hope. He saw younger versions of himself. He began by telling his story. He didn't spare any details. He talked about being unfairly discharged, about living on the streets, about being humiliated in a courtroom, about being judged before having a chance to speak. But he also talked about Thor, about loyalty that transcends circumstances, about how a rescued mutt had been more faithful to the principles of justice than many humans in positions of power. He told the cadets they would face choices, moments where doing the right thing would be difficult, perhaps dangerous, where it would be easier to look the other way, to accept corruption as inevitable. But in those moments, he asked them to remember, not his story specifically, but the principle it represented, that integrity matters, that truth matters, that every person, no matter how invisible society makes them, deserves justice. He pointed to Thor. "This dog," he said, "was discarded for being too old to serve. I was discarded as an inconvenient problem. But together, we brought down a corruption network that operated with impunity for a decade." His voice grew stronger. "Never underestimate the discarded. Never assume that people without power have no value, because sometimes it's exactly those the system ignores who have the courage to change it." The applause was instant and prolonged, but Michael noticed something. A cadet in the 3rd row was crying openly. After the ceremony, she approached. Her name was Julia. She was 22, came from a poor community, was the first in her family to join the NYPD. Everyone doubted she could make it. She thanked Michael because his story had given her something she had lost: hope. Hope that even when the system fails, even when powerful people try to destroy the honest, the truth can still win. Michael hugged her, seeing a reflection of himself decades ago. He said she had something more important than any connection or privilege. She had heart. And as long as she kept that, no one could truly defeat her. 3 years after his acquittal, the Thor project had expanded to 5 cities. 123 teams of rescued dogs and vulnerable humans had been trained. These teams had helped find 47 missing persons, detected evidence in 19 criminal cases that humans alone had not found, saved 16 lives in search and rescue operations. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. They didn't tell about Robert, the first graduate, who now trained other teams. They didn't tell about Max, the rescued Labrador, who found a lost child in the woods after 3 days. They didn't tell about every homeless person who found purpose, every abandoned dog who found a home, every invisible life that was finally seen. Michael was in his office when he received one last unexpected visit. It was Judge Harold Thompson, now retired. Thompson had aged visibly since the trial. Whiter hair, more stooped posture. But his eyes carried something new, humility. He said he had come to apologize personally, for laughing, for mocking, for allowing prejudices to cloud his judgment. Michael offered coffee, and they sat. Thor, now with gray hair on his ears, rested at Michael's feet. Thompson said the case had changed him, forced him to confront how many other judgments he had made based on appearances instead of evidence, how many other people he had humiliated without giving them a chance to be heard. Before retiring, he had spent his last months reviewing cases. He found 7 where he had allowed bias to influence decisions, not criminally, but morally. And he had personally funded resources for those people to receive new, fair trials. It wasn't enough, he admitted. It didn't make up for the damage, but it was all he could do. Michael listened in silence. Then he said something that surprised even himself. He thanked Thompson, not for the initial humiliation, but for allowing the truth to be presented, for not simply convicting Michael without an opportunity for defense. That hadn't been kindness at the time, Thompson admitted. It had been arrogance. He wanted to see Michael fail publicly. Michael knew, but the result, regardless of intention, had been justice. And sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. The 2 men said goodbye with a handshake that carried the weight of mutual understanding, both changed by that day in court. On a winter night, 5 years after it all began, Michael was at home. It was a small house, nothing luxurious, but it was his, and more importantly, it was a home. Thor, now 12 years old, was retired from all active service. His days of finding evidence and sniffing out dangers were over, but he still occasionally trained new teams, showing the younger dogs how to work. Michael was making dinner when Thor started coughing. It wasn't a normal cough. It was deep, painful. The vet confirmed his worst fears 3 days later. Thor had cancer, advanced. At best, he had 6 months. Michael felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. Thor had been by his side at every crucial moment. On the worst nights on the streets, in the courtroom facing mockery, finding evidence no one else saw. No, he wasn't ready to say goodbye. The following months were bittersweet. Michael spent every possible moment with Thor, took him to his favorite places, fed him the best food, made sure every day was full of love. Thor, even weak, still had those deep, intelligent eyes. He still nudged his snout against Michael's hand when he felt he needed comfort. One afternoon, 5.5 months after the diagnosis, Michael took Thor to the beach. He had always wanted to do this, but never had the means while living on the streets. Thor sat on the sand, feeling the warm sun, listening to the waves. Michael sat beside him, hugging the dog who had saved his life in so many ways. He whispered, "Do you know you were the best friend anyone could have? Do you know you saved me more than I saved you?" Thor turned his head, licking Michael's face, and in that gaze, Michael saw understanding. He saw love. He saw farewell. 2 weeks later, on a quiet spring morning, Thor didn't wake up. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, lying in his favorite bed, with Michael by his side. The funeral was small but significant. Miller came with the entire K9 unit. Marcus, Amanda, Isabella, Clara from the NGO, all the graduates of the Thor project, and surprisingly, dozens of homeless people Michael had known over the years. Mrs. Gable, before she died, had said something Michael never forgot. Angels come in all shapes. Sometimes they come with 4 paws. Thor was buried with full NYPD honors. His service medal shone on his chest, and on his headstone was written, "Thor, K9 hero." He found more than evidence. He found justice when humans failed. He taught that loyalty transcends circumstances, and that the discarded can change the world. Michael cried freely. He wasn't ashamed. This was the love of his life. This was the one who had given him purpose when everything had been taken away. But as he cried, he felt something, a presence beside him. He looked down and saw a young brindle dog, caramel with white spots, looking at him with those deep brown eyes. The dog had come with one of the shelters the Thor Project worked with. He had been rescued the previous week, found abandoned near a highway. Michael knelt, and the dog approached, nudging its snout against his hand, exactly as Thor had done decades ago. Clara, from the NGO, approached. She said the dog showed signs of trauma but also exceptional intelligence. She didn't want to pressure Michael so soon after the loss, but Michael looked at the young dog. He saw in him not a replacement for Thor. Nothing could replace Thor, but a continuation, a new story waiting to be written. He asked the dog's name, and Clara replied that he didn't have one yet. He had arrived at the shelter just 4 days ago, hurt and too scared for anyone to approach. Except now. Michael watched how the dog looked at him. It wasn't Thor's gaze. Every dog was unique. But there was something there, a spark of understanding, of connection. He asked if he could spend some time with the dog, and Clara smiled through her tears, saying she had been hoping he would ask that. In the days that followed, Michael and the young brindle spent hours together. The dog was nervous, scared of loud noises, but gradually began to trust. And Michael, in his grief, found purpose again in helping another discarded being. He gave the dog a name, Hope, because that's what they both represented. 6 months later, Michael and Hope formed an official team. She wasn't Thor, she would never be, but she was extraordinary in her own right. She had an exceptional sense of smell and an incredible ability to detect anxiety in humans, making her perfect for finding lost people. Their first official operation was to find a 7-year-old girl who had gotten lost on a hiking trail. Hope located her in 2 hours, when human teams had been searching for 8. When Michael carried the girl back to her parents' arms, he looked at Hope and whispered, "Thor would be proud." Years passed. The Thor Project continued to grow. Michael trained over 500 teams. Each one saved lives. Each one proved that the discarded had immense value. On an autumn afternoon, 10 years after his acquittal, Michael received a call from the governor's mansion. The governor wanted to award him the Medal for Merit, the highest honor the state could bestow. The ceremony was grand. Michael, now 52, hair graying but eyes still bright, took the stage with Hope by his side. The governor spoke about how one man and one dog had exposed corruption, saved countless lives, and transformed the system from within. But when it was Michael's turn to speak, he didn't talk about his achievements. He talked about Thor. He told the story of a dog who was discarded for being too old, who spent 5 years on the streets beside a man the world ignored, who found evidence when everyone laughed at the possibility. "This medal isn't mine," Michael said, his voice echoing through the packed hall. "It's Thor's. It's for all the Thors in the world, dogs and humans, that the system discards, but who have immense value. It's a reminder that invisibility isn't a lack of value. It's a lack of vision from those who look." He looked directly at the cameras broadcasting live. "If you're watching this and feel invisible, feel discarded, know this. You matter. Your story matters. And sometimes all you need is a loyal companion, whether human or animal, who sees your value when no one else does." The applause was deafening, but Michael didn't hear it. He was thinking of Thor, of 5 years of unbreakable loyalty, of a dog who saw a man, not a homeless person. That night, he visited Thor's grave. He placed the medal on the headstone. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. "We changed things. We saved lives. And it all started because you refused to abandon me when everyone else did." Hope sat beside him, and Michael hugged both, the memory of Thor and the reality of hope. Past and future, meeting in the present. A gentle breeze moved the leaves of the nearby trees, and for a moment, Michael could have sworn he heard a familiar bark in the wind.